It is the 13th of May, 1950, a disused wartime airfield in the flat green heart of Northamptonshire, England. Concrete runways where bombers once thundered into the night sky, now marked out with straw bales and painted lines. This is Silverstone, and on this cool spring afternoon, something entirely new is about to begin. For the very first time, the greatest drivers in the world have gathered not merely to race, but to compete for a single, unifying prize. A world championship, a crown that would, from this day forward, define the sport itself. They came in machines that were beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Long sculpted bonnets housing engines mounted at the front, driving the rear wheels. No seatbelts to speak of, no roll bars, cockpits open to the wind. Just a man, a steering wheel, and a great roaring heart of aluminium ahead of his knees. The dominant force that day wore a shade of deep, glorious red. Alfa Romeo, with its fearsome 1.5-litre supercharged straight-eight. The car they called the Alfetta, and leading their charge, three men the press had christened the three Fs: Farina, Fagioli, and a quiet, balding Argentine of extraordinary gifts named Juan Manuel Fangio. The King and Queen of England watched from the grandstand. The engines fired, and the modern history of Formula One drew its very first breath. When the flag fell, it was the Alfa Romeos that surged clear, four of them arranged like scarlet cavalry at the head of the field, and at their very front sat a man of ice-cold precision. Giuseppe Farina, known to all as Nino, an Italian of aristocratic bearing and a driving style that was smooth, upright, utterly unflustered. He would set the pace from the outset that day, refusing to be drawn into a duel, simply extending his lead lap by relentless lap. Behind him, his teammate Fangio pressed hard, the two Alphas trading the fastest laps between them, as the crowd roared across the old airfield. But motor racing, then as now, was a cruel arbiter of fortune. For Fangio's afternoon would not end as he had hoped, and Farina's day was about to become something historic. With just a handful of laps remaining, Fangio's charge came to a sudden and heartbreaking halt. A connecting rod let go deep within that supercharged straight-eight, and the great Argentine coasted to a silent stop, his engine broken, his race run. And so the way was clear. Nino Farina swept on, unopposed and untroubled, the scarlet Alfetta singing across the Northamptonshire concrete as the checkered flag was readied for him. He crossed the line to win the very first race of the very first Formula One World Championship, leading home his teammate Luigi Fagioli, with the Englishman Reg Parnell completing an Alfa Romeo clean sweep of the podium. On that cool spring afternoon, before a king and queen, Giuseppe Farina had written his name at the head of a story that would never end. But that day at Silverstone was only the opening act of a far greater drama, for the championship of 1950 was to be decided across just 7 races, and the two Alfa Romeo teammates, Farina and Fangio, would spend the entire summer locked in a contest of nerve and speed that swung back and forth from one Grand Prix to the next. Fangio struck back, winning in Monaco through the chaos and the crashed cars, and again at Spa and at Reims, that quiet Argentine revealing a genius that would one day make him the greatest of his generation. Yet Farina answered him blow for blow. Switzerland, and then, most crucially of all, the season's finale at Monza. It came down to the very last race. On home soil, before an adoring Italian crowd, Giuseppe Farina held his nerve and took the victory that sealed it. The first Formula One world champion in history. He was 43 years old, a doctor of law, a nephew of the great coach builder Pinin Farina, and a man who had raced through the perilous years before the war and survived them all. Now he was champion of the world. His driving style was upright, elegant, arms outstretched, a manner so widely imitated that it became the very picture of how a racing driver ought to look. Yet history, in its way, would remember the pupil more than the master. For Fangio would go on to win 5 titles and stand for generations as the measure of greatness. But it was Farina who came first, the man who won that opening race at Silverstone, and the man who lifted that very first crown, and so a championship was born. One that would grow and endure and enthrall the world for the better part of a century to come. Consider for a moment the machine that carried him there. The Alfa Romeo 158, the Alfetta, a design whose roots reached back to before the war, to the 1930s. It was small, and slender and beautifully made, its supercharged straight-eight engine screaming to power figures that seemed scarcely believable for its size. In that first season, it was quite simply unbeatable. Alfa Romeo won every single championship Grand Prix they entered. No rival could touch them. The red cars from Milan swept all before them, and the only real contest to be found was the one raging within the team itself. Farina against Fangio, master against pupil, teammate against teammate, for the very first crown ever offered. And when the summer was done, it was the Italian who stood at the summit. But triumph, as ever in this sport, carried within it the seeds of its own ending. For that magnificent Alfetta, so utterly dominant in 1950, was by now a very old design, conceived in another decade, refined and re-refined until there was little left to give. To coax those astonishing power figures from its little supercharged engine, the car drank fuel at a rate almost beyond belief, needing to stop again and again to be replenished. A newer, cleverer rival was stirring at Maranello, the ambitious young mark of Enzo Ferrari, who had once run Alfa's own racing team and now sought to topple his former masters. The reign of the red car Suarez from Milan would not last forever. Yet none of that could ever diminish what had been achieved in that singular historic summer, the season that gave the world its very first champion and gave the sport a beginning from which everything else would flow. So let us return, one final time, to the man at the heart of it all. Giuseppe Farina, the Turin aristocrat, cool and imperious behind the wheel. He drove with a distinctive, upright style, arms outstretched, a poise that would be studied and copied for generations. He was fast. He was fearless, and in that first summer, he was, quite simply, the finest of them all. When the numbers were counted at season's end, he stood above Fangio by the narrowest of margins, a handful of points separating master from pupil. And with that, an ordinary man from Turin became something no one had ever been before. The first world champion of Formula One. His name would forever sit at the very top of the list. The beginning of a lineage that runs, unbroken, all the way to the drivers we cheer today. That was the summer of 1950. The summer it all began. And so, as our story draws towards its close, consider what that single season set in motion. From a windswept airfield in Northamptonshire, a road was opened that would wind through every corner of the globe. From Monaco's harbour to the mountains of Japan, from the deserts of the Middle East to the streets of Singapore aglow beneath the floodlights. It began with the roar of those supercharged Alfettas and the upright, fearless figure of Farina at their head. Fangio would rise, of course, 5 times a champion, the pupil who would eclipse the master and become a legend of his own. And after him, an endless procession, Moss and Clark, Stewart and Lauda, Senna and Prost, Schumacher and Hamilton, each name written into a book that Farina had opened first. That is the true legacy of 1950. Not merely a champion crowned, but a beginning that never ended. The summer it all began, and from which everything ever since has flowed. And so we come to the very last page of our story. That first extraordinary summer now behind us, its echoes still ringing down the decades. Think of it. A handful of races, a scattering of circuits across Europe, a grid of men in cork helmets and cotton overalls, no safety barriers to speak of, no seatbelts, no fireproof suits, only courage and the deafening song of those engines. From such humble, dangerous, glorious beginnings grew the greatest motor racing championship the world has ever known. Giuseppe Farina lit that flame at Silverstone, and it has never once gone out. So the next time you hear those engines fire, remember the airfield, remember the Alfettas, and remember the upright man from Turin who was, quite simply, the first. The summer it all began. And this has been its story.